Dave Talks Comics, Episode 90, Baltimore Comic-Con 2015, Part 1. Welcome to Dave Talks Comics, a program on the subjects of, well, in this case, this is usually where the part where I say how this is a podcast or program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons, and usually it is, but this episode is all about the first day of Baltimore Comic-Con 2015. So there's no need to say anything about talking about comic books or cartoons or telling you that I'll be handing out spoilers or including a spoiler warning here. Instead, I just want to say that I will be talking about panels I attended and books I bought and things I saw and what I ate on the first day of this year's Baltimore Comic-Con. That is the 2015 Baltimore Comic-Con. Today was the first day of Baltimore Comic-Con 2015. I drove up. The con didn't open until 1 o'clock. I drove up to Baltimore. I live about, well, depending on the traffic, I live anywhere from 40 minutes to an hour from downtown Baltimore. And today it took it was more like an hour's drive because I was driving in the middle of a weekday. I left around, well, a little before 11, and I think I got there a little before 12. It was just about an hour that it took me. I made arrangements in advance. I got a parking place in advance through Parking Panda and got what I thought was a pretty decent rate. It was $12 for the day, and I think most garages that were closer to the convention center than where I parked, it was more like $20 or more for the day. I figured it was going to be expensive, and that's why I made the arrangements in advance. And the place where I parked, it was a lot. It wasn't a garage. It was probably about a mile from the convention center, but I think it was worth it. And actually, there was a bus that I could have taken. I could have walked over a couple blocks and caught one of those Baltimore circulator buses. I think it's the purple bus. And that would have taken, and that's free. The circulator buses are free. But I chose to walk, and actually I stopped along the way about halfway between the parking lot and the convention center. I stopped at the Mekong Delta Cafe. Now, I'd been to the Mekong Delta Cafe in previous years. It's a Vietnamese restaurant. It used to be on Saratoga Street. Now it's on Charles Street. It's still owned by the same people. And the food still tastes the same as far as I can tell. Now, I only go there about once a year because I don't go up to Baltimore very frequently. But I enjoyed it. The only thing was I just couldn't eat it all. I had not had an early breakfast, and I honestly didn't think I was going to be hungry enough to eat when I got out of the car. But then as I started to walk down closer to the restaurant, closer to the convention center, I started to get a little hungry. And first I was thinking maybe I'll just have some summer rolls, or maybe I'll just get summer rolls to take with me into the convention center. And then by the time I got to the restaurant, I wanted soup. And so I got there, I don't think they call it this anymore, but what they used to call it was the Mekong Delta noodle soup, which has pork, and barbecued pork and shrimp in it. I wasn't hungry enough to eat the whole thing, but I ate probably 3/4 of it or more. But I left a little bit of shrimp and a little bit of pork and some noodles and some broth at the bottom of the bowl. So after I finished that, it was getting close to 1 o'clock. So I walked down. I probably got to the convention center about 5 after 1. I walked right in, didn't have any problems. No line or anything. I just handed one of the guys at the front door the the printout that I had of my receipt, and he gave me I'm not sure what to call these, a bracelet or whatever they are. You know, those tapes that you tape around your wrist, and I've got to wear it for the next couple days if I want to continue to go to the convention. So I went downstairs and I walked around the convention floor. This is the same floor that they used last year, and I think either last year or the year before was the first year that they used this part of the convention center. I'm not as crazy about this. It's almost like a kind of triangular. It's got this triangular shape, but then it's got these kind of, well, I don't know. It's like a big triangular shape for the most part. And I walked around for the most part, I just walked around the retailer section initially. There was some panels that I wanted to go to. So for the moment, the first panel, well, it started at 2:30. I got there at 1. I thought it started at 2. I didn't check the schedule. So I left the convention floor at just before 1 to head up to the panel room. But before I did that, I walked around mostly just through the retailers. There's kind of 3 sections in the Baltimore Comic-Con. There's kind of a section, there's the retailer section, which is what you walk into when you first walk onto the convention floor. And then off to the left, there is a section where there's a lot of creators, both mainstream and otherwise, but not small press people who were from like publishing houses or other organizations. There are some publishers that were there, like I think Valiant was there, and IDW, and I think a few others. So it's slipping my mind which ones. And then if you walk all the way through, if instead of turning left to go down to them, if you walk all the way through the retailers, you come to a section where there's a lot of indie people. And when I say indie people, I mean people who are really small press, people who are doing their own books or their own crafts, because they're not all, I mean, I'd say most of them are artists, but they're not all people who are creating comic books. So some of them are creating other things that you can buy. And actually, I didn't even notice that until late in the day, but I'll get back to that. So I walked around the retailer section. I was looking for, one thing I had in mind that I wanted to find was the next volume of the DC Archives, the 4th volume of the DC Archives of Doom Patrol. I found a few boxes that had archive editions in them, but I didn't find any volumes of the Doom Patrol. I also looked through some of the big, let's see, are they tabloid size? The big, I guess tabloid size, treasury sized, I think that's what they call them, comic books. I was looking for that Flash versus Superman race book, which I think I had. I think my parents bought that for me back like in 75, I think it was, something like that, when we were about to go on a flight overseas. And I don't know what happened to that. I mean, that's been gone for years, but I'm almost certain that I had that book. Me and my brother had that book. So I would like to get another copy. I've seen it online for in the range of like the $25 range, and I was hoping I could find, I didn't see any copies of that. I flipped through some other treasury-sized comics, but not that. I did find a box of, on one dealer had a couple boxes of books which ranged from, I'd say stuff from the 60s, well, probably even stuff prior to the 60s. There's probably even some stuff from the 50s in there, up through, well, a lot of it was like 50s, 60s, 70s. And they were all in fairly good shape, but they weren't things that were in high demand. And they were all $2 each. And so I flipped through them. I saw a number of things that looked interesting. But I managed to hold off until I ran across a copy of Adventure Comics number 425. This was cover dated, it was December of 72, January of 73, so it was bi-monthly at this point. This was the first issue after Supergirl had been the feature in there prior to issue 425, and then she got her own book. And so they were doing something new, and so this is like the all new adventure. And so so what this issue had, and what intrigued me about it was the different stories in it. The first story, I couldn't find the name at first, but it was an Alex Toth story. Well, at least it was drawn by Alex Toth. And it was kind of a neat story. Well, it wasn't a great story. I really liked it because it was drawn by Alex Toth. But it was about a guy who travels to the Far East, up into, I guess, it's supposed to be the mountains of Tibet, and comes to a mountaintop where there are these horses, these winged horses, and he wants to take one back, and of course his guides who have led him up there, who are from Tibet, warn him against doing this, and some of them actually get killed by some of these horses, but he insists on taking this young horse back with him, which has not grown its wings yet, and of course it all ends badly. It has a very Twilight Zone type feel to it. I haven't read, I've read one other little story. I can't remember who the artist was on that one. But anyway, there's another story that's drawn by Gil Kane in there. And then there's the first appearance of Captain Fear, who was a pirate, and who had like 5 or 6 appearances in Adventure Comics. And I'm not sure if he's appeared anywhere else since then, but this was his first appearance. So the issue wasn't in great shape, it's probably in very good or something like that. It's a little beat up, but it's intact. In fact, the first page, I thought that it had been separated, that the cover had been separated from the inside, because the way the first page was drawn, it looked at first, when I first looked at it, like it was upside down. And I did a double take. I kind of looked at the page more closely, and then I realized that's how Alex Toth had drawn it. But there's some very cool. I would really love to see. Unfortunately, because it's not in the best of shape, the color isn't in great shape, and I don't know, even in a pristine copy, how good the color would be in this. I really would like to read a copy, see these pages uncolored, just pencil and ink, either the originals or a good reproduction of the originals, but odds of me ever seeing that are probably slim. I don't know, maybe there's some book out there that has reprinted some of these pages. So I've read that story, and there's another story about aliens and Adolf Hitler, and it's only 2 pages. And I mentioned the other 2 stories already. So that was it for. So at that point, it was getting close to 2:00 when I thought the panel was beginning, but it turns out all the panels were beginning at 2:30. So I went upstairs, found the panel room. I had to decide which panel I was going to go to, because there was actually 2 panels that sounded interesting. The other one was, let's see, let me grab where did I put here's the program guide. The other panel was flipping through, let's see. Well, I went to the New Mutants panel, but the other panel that sounded, I know what it was. It was the Living in Harmony digital and print panel. But I figured I've heard things like that on certain podcasts, although Mark Waid was on the panel. And let's see, was there anybody else that really... Well, Katie Cook, I had something by her, a card. I'm not sure what happened to it. But I decided to go to the New Mutants panel. I decided I want to go to something nostalgic. Now, I have not read a lot of new issues in the New Mutants. I have, I think, 6 issues in the New Mutants. Issues 1 through 5 and issue 17 for some reason. I know I've read 1 through 5. I'm not sure if I ever read 17. I think 17 is the first issue. No, it's not. I was going to say I think it's the first issue that Bill Sienkiewicz drew, but I don't think it is. I don't think that's true. I think it's a couple, either the issue after that or the one after that, 18 or 19, I think. So this panel was just 2 people. It was Louise Simonson and Bob McLeod. Bob McLeod was the original penciler and inker of the New Mutants, He penciled and inked their first appearance as a team, because some of them had appeared before, at least one of them had appeared before. Their first appearance as a team in the Marvel graphic novel number 4, which I have read. I don't own it, but I have read it. I read it, back in the day when it first came out in 82 or something like 83, something like that. And he also penciled and inked the first annual. He penciled issues 1 through 3. I'm talking about Bob McLeod here. And he also inked, but did not pencil, issues 4, 5, 7, 8, and 75. And there's been a few revivals that he's also done some work on, but that's basically it. Now, Louise Simonson was the original editor. She was the editor for the X-Men books at this time. At the time the New Mutants came out, so she was the editor on the original graphic novel, and she was also the editor for the first 16 issues of New Mutants. And I think she said at that point, when she went over to DC to work on Superman. I guess with John Byrne. So there was a slideshow that Bob McLeod had put together, which basically consisted of some pictures of covers from New Mutants, work that he'd done on it was all work that he'd done on New Mutants, but some covers, some commissions that he'd done, some original art, some pictures of the uncolored pages, even some rough sketches, some concept art that they had done. They got started by talking about how the New Mutants came about, and apparently there was a gap. Well, I mean, they'd been planning this, but there was a gap in the original graphic novel schedule. I think it was actually Louise's husband, Walt Simonson, was supposed to be producing the next graphic novel. But he wasn't. Okay, somebody was late, and so they decided to do the New Mutants graphic novel. Bob McLeod ended up penciling and inking the entire thing. He was rushed on it, and apparently he took this on his honeymoon. He was just getting married, and he took this on his honeymoon and actually worked on it on his honeymoon. And he said, if you don't like the way it looks, if you think it looks rushed, that's because I was burning through it very quickly, trying to get it all done. The graphic novel, the inking on the graphic novel. And he also said about being, a regular, because he didn't really want to be the regular penciler on this book, even though he penciled the first 3 issues, then inked a number of other issues. He said he wasn't ready to take on a regular book at this point. He talked a little bit. Well, he mentioned the name Mort Drucker, who was an artist who I am not familiar with. I've heard the name quite a few times, but I'm not familiar with his work. But he talked about Mort Drucker as being an influence on him. They talked a little bit about some of the changes that happened in the development process from when they were first planning the book to the way it actually turned out. The biggest difference, they said, was that Rain, the character who I believe is Scott's, who's the one who turns into a werewolf, or I guess is a werewolf, I don't know. Do you turn into is what you turn into the werewolf, or being a werewolf means that you can change into a wolf-like creature? I don't know. But she was originally supposed to be Iranian, apparently. That was the original plan, and they didn't say exactly why it was changed, or if they did, I missed that part. And Sunspot apparently was going to be a much bigger character. They talk about him as being, the idea was to make him a bigger Hulk-like character, but I guess they didn't want him to look just like the Hulk or too much like the Hulk, and so they toned that down. They said that they tried to include characters of various ethnicities, and there was a little bit of discussion about why they did that. Bob said that he left the book unhappy. He wasn't real happy with all of his work there, with the way it looked, and that he was unaware of the royalty system, which had just kicked into place about the time he had started. at Marvel, or just before he had started at Marvel. They talked a little bit about Bill Sienkiewicz, who I mentioned before, and I think who came on around issue 18 or 19 and penciled it for about a year or a little over a year. And that apparently Ann Nocenti, who was the editor who took over after Louise left, after Wheezy left, that she was the one who brought in Bill Sienkiewicz. They talked a little bit about Chris Claremont, who I should have mentioned by now because he co-created the New Mutants with Bob McLeod. He was the writer, as he was also the writer for, of course, the X-Men at this point, and had been since issue 94. Let's see. One of the things they said about Chris was that Chris had this tendency to provide these scripts that were too long. That he would give you, if the book was supposed to be 20 pages, he would give you 25 pages worth of material, and that he would kind of leave it up to the artist to cut things back, and he was entirely aware that this is what he did. They talked a little bit about killing off characters, and how it was, at that time, it was quite often left up to the creators, the people, the writer, the artist on the book, that it wasn't something that was mandated by editorial. And, I mean, they talked a little bit about Karma getting knocked off, and Karma was one of the original characters in New Mutants, and she actually appeared before the New Mutants graphic novel. She first appeared in Marvel Team-Up number 100. They also said that the original plan called for introducing more New Mutants characters. So, in other words, over the course of the series, they said that they had plans to introduce more characters, although they didn't. I mean, and there were new characters that were introduced over the course of the series, but the way they talked about it kind of made me think that it was more characters than were actually introduced, or that they would have been introduced on a more regular basis. They would have been bringing in new characters. And that was really about it. It wasn't my favorite panel. I think that Bob McLeod isn't... I think Wheezy has no problem. Louise Simonson, has no problem talking, and she enjoys telling stories. But I don't think Bob McLeod... The same can be said of Bob McLeod. And so it wasn't quite as entertaining a talk as I would have liked it to be. Also, they talked for maybe 20 minutes at the beginning, and then they threw it open to questions, as opposed to, waiting until, like, say, the last 10 or 15 minutes and opening it up to questions. So it was, in a way, it was guided in part by the questions from the audience, at least half of the panel. And also there was one other person who was supposed to be on the panel, and that was Brett Blevins, and he's also supposed to be at the show. I'm not sure what happened there, why he didn't show up. Nobody asked, and they didn't give an explanation for what happened. Well, I'm planning to read more New Mutants. It's one of those books I want to get back to and try reading again. I want to read the first 5 issues again. I guess I'm going to have to buy the graphic novel in some form if I want to get it, and if I want to read that again. And I would like to read at least through, I think, some of the stuff by Bill Sienkiewicz. The Demon Bear saga, or the Demon Bear story, whichever it is one that I've heard a lot of good things about, and I think that's the first story that he drew. So that's about it for the New Mutants panel. After the New Mutants panel, I had a decision to make. There was 2 panels starting 15 minutes later, which appealed to me, and I had to decide. The first one was the Spinner Rack Revolution panel, which focused on publishers in the 1970s, on some of these magazines that they produced, like Heavy Metal, Vampirella, Epic Illustrated, 1984, and Savage Sword of Conan. It was presented by Alex Cox of the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. It sounded great, but I decided to go with the other panel, which possibly has the longest name of any of the panels at this year's convention. And that is the Beg, Borrow, and Steal, Adapting, Incorporating, and Drawing Inspiration from Myth, Legend, and Literature panel. This was moderated by Paul Storrie, and the panelists were Ron Randall, Greg Pak, Walt Simonson, and Jamal Igle. Ron Randall's the only one that I'm not familiar with. I have read books by Greg Pak and Walt Simonson. I have a commission from Jamal Igle that I think I got back in 2012 at Heroes Con. I don't know if I've actually read any of his books, though. I mean, the books he's drawn or written, for that matter. I think he's had a lot more drawing than writing, but I'm not certain on that. The moderator, Paul Storrie, opened the panel by asking about what some of the challenges were of using pre-existing myths and legend. And before I say anything more about that, I also want to say that the name of the panel implied that they would also be talking about things taken from literature, but they really didn't talk about that at all. I was tempted to ask a question, but it kind of felt like it would have just been an attempt it would have sounded like I was trying to derail the conversation. So I just went ahead and I listened to it, and it was an interesting discussion, even if it didn't go exactly where I wanted it to, or even if it did, it seemed a little too sharply focused on the subjects of myths and legends. At least, I don't know, for my taste. I thought it was going to be a little more broad-based discussion than that. The first person to respond to the question was Jamal Igle, and he talked about bonuses and hurdles. Specifically, he mentioned that one of the advantages, and I guess that would be a bonus, of using a pre-existing myth or legend is that you have what he described as a built-in point of reference, and I think by that he means that people are already familiar with some of these characters. They know who they are, and you don't have to... You're going to explain to them who they are, but they already know something about them, or at least they think they know something about them. And that's a definite advantage. The next person to talk was Walt Simonson, and he talked a little bit about his personal background with myths and legends, specifically reading Beowulf when he was young, his interest in science fiction, his interest in Greek and Roman and Norse mythology, and he also mentioned The Lord of the Rings. He mentioned how he thought it was awesome that the Norse gods all die. And I think that's more or less what he said. That's probably not an exact quote, but he said something along. He definitely used the word awesome, and he definitely mentioned it in connection with the fact that the Norse gods all die at Ragnarok, which is, of course, the final battle in Norse mythology. And he said when he uses myths and legend, I mean, he did write the Thor book for a few years back on a very important run of the Thor book back in the early 80s, early to mid 80s. He said that he would borrow, but he would always try to add something new or different. And although he didn't mention him by name, he definitely referred to Beta Ray Bill when he talked about what if somebody else could pick up the hammer? What if there was somebody else who was worthy of the hammer, of Thor's hammer? And that's a really good story, even though just that first 4-issue story, and that is available on Comixology, or if you've got Marvel Unlimited, I believe it's available there as well. Greg Pak talked about a little bit about World War Hulk, and Hercules and Amadeus Cho, and this is actually, I haven't read a lot by Greg Pak. In fact, this may be the only thing by Greg Pak that I've read, but I did read the collection of, what did they call it, The Incredible Hercules, I think it was called, when Hulk was sent off in a rocket and wound up on some distant planet. What they did was they had Hercules take over his book, and so it went from being Incredible Hulk to, I think it was Incredible Hercules. And I bought the first trade collection, and I believe that's when they introduced Amadeus Cho, who was this really smart guy. I'm not sure if he was supposed to be a teenager or if he just looked like a teenager because he was very young looking. But it was kind of a Laurel and Hardy, well, I don't know if Laurel and Hardy is the best comparison, but, Odd Couple type situation. But I'm kind of getting away from the important part, which is that, of course, Hercules is a mythological character, and that's where the character originally came from. So Greg Pak talked about how they would do these flashbacks, which he referred to as mythbacks, because in the flashbacks they would go back to the Greek myths of Hercules. In fact, I think they even sometimes got a little bit into Hercules versus, I believe he was called Heracles in the Roman myths. And so you'd see Hercules in the present, but then they would show a flashback or a mythback to something that from the myths from 2,000 plus years ago. And he also Greg Pak also talked about the darker parts of the Hercules mythos. I mean, how that he was the reason why he had to go on the 12 labors of Hercules. The reason why he had to do that was because he had been drugged and he had killed his wife and children, and that there was a lot of things like that in a lot of these myths. And I don't know if there was a point to that other than to just point that. Well, okay, yes, there was a point to that. The point to that was that this gave Hercules some knowledge of, he had experienced dark things and he had had bad things happen in his life, and that was used when he was trying to curry favor or to convince the Hulk that he understood what he had been through. And it also was something that could be used as a point of comparison, it being this dark past of Hercules could be used as a point of comparison with the way that Hercules is normally portrayed in the Marvel Universe, which is usually as a kind of a big frat boy or kind of a party boy, somebody who likes to drink and to fight and have a good time, but isn't very, very smart. And let's see, what else did Greg Pak say? He also said that the Greek gods were a good fit for the Marvel Universe because, like a lot of the superheroes, they were very imperfect and they were superpowered. So they fit right into the Marvel Universe. It was a very good fit. And that you could find all this in the old legends, in the old stories. It wasn't something that he had to make up. It wasn't. It was all there. So I didn't take notes on everything that was said, but there were some audience questions. I didn't take any notes on what Ron Randall said, but there were some audience questions about about superheroes as mythological characters, and I think the panelists kind of put that idea down that it wasn't a very good comparison because these were not the characters that they were using, the mythological characters that they were using in their stories were characters who came from myths that explained creation and life on Earth, as opposed to superheroes, which are kind of escapist fiction. So, despite the fact that the Greek gods in many ways resemble Marvel superheroes, they didn't think that superheroes as mythological characters equaled some of these other mythological characters. There was also a question about non-European based myths and legends and why we don't see more of them, and do the panelists have any plans to use any more of them? Somebody pointed out that Dwayne McDuffie had some, I believe it was Anansi, in his JLA run, which I have not read. And that also there was a part of World War Hulk which dealt with, was it World War Hulk? No, I don't think it was World War Hulk. You know what? I think it was Invasion, when the Skrulls were invading. I think that's what it was, although I'm not certain. Where the gods of Earth, from various parts of Earth, were battling the Skrull gods or something. This is something I remember hearing about when this stuff was coming out, hearing about on podcasts, but I never read the story, so I'm not super familiar with it. Walt Simonson, kind of in response to this question about why they don't use more non-European based myths, well, he didn't really respond to it in that way. What he responded was by talking about why he explained more about why he liked the Norse mythology, and he said that was because it was, and this is my word, he said that they were fragmentary and that there weren't many stories, and which left him a lot of room to fill things in, and he liked that. And that's why he's done a lot with Norse mythos. The final question from the audience was, are myths watered down? And I think the answer is basically yes, but you can still find the older versions out there, the versions where the bad guys are really punished in very harsh ways, and the darker versions of some of these fairy tales, which do not turn out as happy as they do in some of the Disney versions of these fairy tales. So that was it for the Beg, Borrow, and Steal panel. It was good. There was a bit of as with the previous panel and the next panel, there was a bit of a problem with the air conditioning system, and so there was a bit of noise from that. It wasn't overpowering. And I enjoyed the panel, even though I thought I was going to get more than just a discussion of the use of Greek and Norse myths in DC and Marvel comic books, which was kind of what it felt like a heavy portion of the discussion revolved around. The third and final panel that I went to today was the Stories I Haven't Told Yet panel. It was moderated by Robert Greenberger, whom I have seen at a number of panels over the years at the Baltimore Comic-Con. The panelists were John Ostrander, who I know best from Suicide Squad and Grim Jack. Ron Marz, I think I've read a few comics that he's written, but I don't think I've read very much. Louise Simonson, who was on the New Mutants panel, was also on this panel. And Terry Moore, who's probably best known for his run on, all of his creator-owned stuff, which the most famous of which is Strangers in Paradise, which I have read a good chunk of, although I did not finish it. The panel opened by Robert Greenberger asking the panelists about their pre-comic books background. In other words, what kind of work they did before they got into writing comic books. John Ostrander talked about being a playwright briefly. Ron Marz talked about being a sports reporter. Louise Simonson, talked about being working in magazine sales to newsstands, and Terry Moore talked about being a musician. Then they got into a little bit of discussion, and the discussion revolved around a few things. I mean, it was kind of a discussion about writing as well as a discussion about stories that they haven't told. I think part of the idea and what made this panel sound enticing was that they would talk about stories that they wanted to tell that they didn't get around to telling. And Louise and Wheezy talked a little bit about, she talked about this Galactus Silver Surfer story where it sounded like Galactus knew that he was going to die or be killed, and he was grooming the Silver Surfer to, this wasn't clear to me, to take his place or something like that. But she said that there had been an earlier part to the story which she had either written or she'd been the editor on, and she wanted to see the second part come out, but then she kind of implied that somebody may have already done something very similar to her idea for the second part. Anyway, Terry Moore, most of his work has been on independent comic books, on his own comic books, creator-owned comic books. But he did have a short stint at DC working on Birds of Prey, and he talked about Batman, how he hates Batman. And he had this idea for a story which never came to pass, in which Batman sees this girl get killed, and the body's taken to the morgue, and I think he catches the bad guys, and then the next day he's out on patrol again, and he sees the same girl again. And that's as far as Terry kind of went with this idea of this dead girl. But he did say that he used this idea in one of his other creator-owned books. I think Rachel Rising was the name of the book. And I have not read that one at all. So I've heard a little bit about it, but I really am not familiar with the book. I don't know exactly what it's about, other than I assume it must have something to do with rising from the dead. Ron Marz talked, well, this is where we got into a little bit of talk about writing in general. He talked about the finite amount of time and resources, and how even if you've got these ideas, there's only, so much time to write them in. He talked a little bit about working at DC on Green Lantern, and how he had some Hal Jordan stories that he never got around to, or that weren't okayed because they were a little too close to the idea of multiple universes. And this was before this of course is in the time when we officially just had one DC universe. Once again, as far as the talking about the difference between, creator-owned versus working for DC or Marvel, Terry Moore, compared it to being solo versus working in a band. And then John Ostrander told the story, which I thought this was the jewel that made this. This was a great panel. This was my favorite panel of the day. But this story really made it worthwhile. And he told, this was very brief, but he told the story about his idea for a Batman Elseworld story, which he said never happened because he got this idea right about the time they decided that they didn't want to do any more Elseworld stories. But his idea was that it would open with Thomas and Martha Wayne getting killed, just as they do. And I think this was supposed to be said, I think he said back in the 1930s, just as they do in Batman's origin. But then also Bruce Wayne also gets killed. And then the case gets investigated by a detective, Jim Corrigan. And Bruce Wayne then rises from the dead to become the Spectre. And Jim Corrigan puts on a costume to fight crime and basically becomes Batman. And there was this really cool moment once he explained it all, and there was this kind of quiet reaction from the audience where everyone was like, oh. And it's kind of a neat moment, and it was a very cool story. The more I think about it, I'm not sure exactly what he would do with it. I mean, it's kind of a neat setup, but I think it needs more than that, and maybe he had more ideas than that. But that's the part that he related to us. Louise Simonson talked a little bit about what it was like to be an editor. Ron Marz, once again, we get back to this, ideas are everywhere, that there's tons of publishers, and the means of publishing are available to all. And I think this was because there was a lot of people. I think there was some talk during the panel of people would come to them with an idea and say, here's an idea for you. And his feeling was, we've all got ideas, you know. If just because I haven't come up with this story doesn't mean I haven't thought of it before. And John Ostrander also talked about the need to make a living. In other words, that would often prevents him from doing the creator-owned stories that he sometimes wants to tell, is that he needs to make money, and so he ends up taking the jobs from DC and Marvel and other companies, because he's done some work for, I think he did work for Dark Horse when Dark Horse had the Star Wars license, and he said that, you know, and the money is very good. You know, it's much better that way. It's much more reliable that way. Terry Moore talked about partnering with his wife, how she handles the business end of things, and how he sees other couples that do the same thing. And I think he had gotten a question about that from Robert Greenberger, but that's about as far as that went. And then there was a little bit of discussion about how they don't like to listen to other people's stories. And both for legal reasons, they don't want to get accused of stealing something, and also because for legal reasons, and I guess for moral reasons as well. You know, they would rather the people write these stories themselves if they've got these ideas. And Wheezy talked about how at a convention, and I don't know how long ago this was, but this 11-year-old kid had come up to her and had said he had some ideas for stories, and she thought, oh, well, he's an 11-year-old kid. How good can these ideas be? And then the kid started reeling off these story ideas, and after about 2 or 3, she told him to just stop talking and to go home, and, you know, and well to stop telling her these ideas, because these were really good ideas. And she wanted the kid to have the opportunity to tell these stories himself. And then John Ostrander told a story about how somebody had tried to tell him about this idea he had for a story about this character, and it went into all this detail. And he said his reaction was, well, that's great, but Cyclops, there's already a character named Cyclops. And then the guy got really angry because apparently this guy had green eye beams, not red eye beams. And Terry Moore talked a little bit about how he found that if you sit on ideas long enough, then they tend to show up elsewhere. You know, other people get the same idea, so it's not that people are always stealing from one another. It's just, you know, these ideas are out there. People get inspired by similar things, or sometimes the same thing, and come up with the same idea or a very similar idea. There was an audience question about, and this was more on the writing side of things and not as opposed to the story side, should you be creating more than consuming? And basically, I think everybody on the panel agreed on this. Ron Marz said, you know, that was a bunch of BS, and that you have to experience things. You have to go out and do things. You can't just spend all your time writing. And John Ostrander talked about how the reason why he became a writer was because he was a reader. He enjoyed reading so much. And then Terry Moore talked about how he sees himself as a prism reflecting out the things that he's taking in. And as he takes in more and more, the prism becomes bigger and bigger. And I guess more powerful, or, yeah, I mean, it's just, it enhances its ability, I guess. And then the final audience question was on creative walls, you know, I mean, writer's block. And Ron Marz said he felt that there's no such thing as writer's block. And And Terry Moore said something about how amateurs write when they want to and professionals write on demand, and that you just have to push through these things. You have to keep writing. To use my own words, I would say you can't be too precious. And honestly, I felt I can relate that to this podcast, because there are times that I feel that I need to record, but I don't feel that I completely have it all together, and yet I will still record. And sometimes my recordings come out really great, and I really love what I have to say, and I really love the way I put it all together. And other times I don't, but I try to keep pushing ahead with it. And obviously I'm not a professional at this. I don't get paid to do this. I pay to do this, or I pay at least to put it up on the internet. But this was a great panel. I really enjoyed it. I thought there was a lot of great discussion here. Everybody on the panel seemed to be very interested in being there and interested in talking, and interested in interacting with one another and interacting with the audience. And so there was a lot of good talk. I loved that story that John Ostrander, that Elseworld story that he said he wanted to tell. I'd love to see that, something like that put down, but actually come out. But gems like that are what make panels like this worthwhile. So I went to these 3 panels back to back to back. There was like a 15-minute break in between, but it really wasn't enough time to go down and spend any time on the show floor. So I just stayed up there. In fact, the second and third panel were in the same room. And after the third panel, it was 6 o'clock. The show was open until 7. So I went downstairs to the floor. I walked around a lot. I tried to walk through. I didn't go through the retailer area, really. I walked through the areas that I hadn't been through before. So I walked through the area where the publishers and a lot of the creators were, although I didn't make it through all of that because it's kind of split up a little bit. But I made it through the large section of it, the section that's off to the left. And after I went through all that, I did see one thing that I think I want to go back and buy. I saw a number of things that looked interesting, But I've got so many comic books. I've got so many comic books that I have not read. So many things that I already have on my list to read. I don't need to be buying a ton of stuff. So at this point, I had only spent $2 on that issue of Adventure Comics. The one thing that I did see that I want to go back, and that's, I noticed that Dean Haspiel is here at Baltimore Comic-Con. And I've just about finished off Heart-Shaped Hole. In fact, I'm going to finish that off tonight or tomorrow morning. And I think I'm going to pick up one of his other books tomorrow, which is probably going to cost me a little more. But I think it'll be worth it. I really have enjoyed Heart-Shaped Hole so far. But other than that, I got stopped by a couple people who tried to get me interested in their stuff. And I try to be polite, make a little conversation. The only person who really, I thought, did it right was the guy who asked me, how's it going? Or how's the con been for you? The people who try to rope me in by asking me, what am I interested in? Or what do you think about this comic? Or you would probably like this. That just doesn't work. And honestly, I was still kind of I like to make my first pass through without really stopping to spend too much time looking at things. If stopping at a table means I have to engage in conversation, I mean have to engage in conversation, means somebody's going to approach me and start talking to me, then, especially early in the convention, I don't always feel like doing that. Later on, I'm a little more open to it. But usually when I'm first going through, and this was my first pass through Artist Alley, I'm not as interested. So after I went through Artist Alley, then there's this other section, which I guess, I don't know if it's considered part of Artist Alley or what, but it's like at the back of the floor, and I completely missed it. And this section was here last year when I was at the convention, so it's not like I hadn't seen this before, because they were in the same room last year. But for some reason, I just completely missed it when I was going through before. And so I only had like 20 minutes left at this point, so I started to zip through there, and that was where the one person stopped me who asked me how the con was going for me. In fact, another funny story, I had somebody stop me when I was in Artist Alley, asked me, "You want a free comic book?" And I said, no thanks. I'm not sure if that probably wasn't the response he wanted. And normally I would just be uber polite and say, "Oh yeah, sure, I'll take that." But I just didn't feel like taking it. So I didn't. I think it was somebody from the Valiant booth, but I'm not sure. So I zipped through this section. I'll probably go back through again. I don't know if I'm going to buy any art tomorrow. There's a number of panels that I want to go to. I would like to go through the retailer section again. Maybe I'll find something that I didn't spot before. I did spot a table or a booth that had a lot of $1 books, so I might go through those. What I'm really looking for is for stuff that I can't find, that is not available electronically. And that comic book that I bought today, I'll bet will never be available electronically. Adventure Comics 425. It just, I don't know. I seriously doubt it will. So it's things like that I'm looking for. And also there are some collected editions that I would be interested in. Like I mentioned the Doom Patrol earlier. But I'm just, then there was that one table in Artist Alley where they had all these posters out there, these nice blow-ups of comic book covers. I think it was DC Comics, a lot of Batman, and it looked interesting. And I was like, oh, these look nice. And I started to go through them, and I thought I had looked at the prices before I went through them. And then as I was about halfway through this section, I look up at the pricing, and it's $40 a poster. I was like, okay. And then at that point, I just turned around and walked out of the booth because I just wasn't interested in spending that much on a poster. It's been 10, 15, maybe 20, but 40 for something that's basically just a blown-up version of a cover that somebody else did? No thanks. No thanks. Let's see, was there anything else? Well, I didn't run into anybody that I knew at the con today, but that's not too surprising, especially considering the fact that I spent, 1, 2, 3, almost 4 hours, basically, upstairs in the panel rooms, because there was 3 hours worth of panels plus, 3.5 hours upstairs in the panel rooms. But I didn't run into anybody that I knew. The other thing about that last hour on the convention floor is there's a lot of people who had packed up or were packing up and leaving as I got down there at 6 o'clock, 6:05. So there was a lot of tables I went past that were empty. So I'm sure it's going to be a lot more crowded tomorrow. I'm going in earlier because the con opens at 10 tomorrow, and I would like to be there when it opens. I think I'm going to have lunch or breakfast in Baltimore tomorrow. I think that's about it. I can't think of anything else. Yeah, so I've got lots of plans for more panels to go to tomorrow. And I will get to those in the next recording that I make. That's it for episode 90 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com, on Twitter at Dave Talks Comics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. Dave Talks Comics can also be found at facebook.com/DaveTalksComics. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be talking about the second day of Baltimore Comic Con 2015. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.